Hi, and welcome to the Good Girl Confessional Podcast. Welcome back. I'm your host, Sandy Lowries, and the Good Girl Confessional Podcast is proudly brought to us by WB40, Women Beyond 40, a platform for women 40, 50, 60, and beyond who want to talk about the nitty-gritty of life in midlife. You can join us at WB40.com. Before we begin today's podcast, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which this podcast is recorded, and in my case, that's the Wiradjuri people of the Kulin Nations, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and pay homage to their ancient history of storytelling. Today in the podcast, I am very excited to be talking to Sarah Steele. Sarah, for those that don't know, is an incredible podcast host. Her podcast is Let's Talk About Sex, where she talks about sex, cults, and coercive control. And Sarah is a producer, writer, podcast presenter, and filmmaker, and she is the author of her incredible book, Do As I Say. It is a fantastic book. If you're interested at all of the links are going to be in our show notes, and I highly recommend that you go out and read this book. It's really great. If you love a good podcast, you will really love this. It is a very serious podcast that really does look at the societal issues of coercive control and cults, how they start, and how people are involved in them, and more importantly, how people are supported when they're able to leave. Please welcome to the confessional the very lovely Sarah Steele.
Hey there! When Sandy's not interviewing kick-ass women, she's hanging out with me at Alex the Seal, a podcast about music and nostalgia. I'm Jo Pybus, and each episode, Sandy and I talk about all the songs that got us hooked up, knocked up, and broken up. Do yourself a favour and search Alex the Seal on your podcast app. Love you, Molly.
Hi, Sarah, and welcome to the confessional. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you, and thanks for having me.
Oh, I am very excited to have you because I'm a huge fan of your brilliant podcast, Let's Talk About Sex, and I can never say that right because of my little list here. I knew this would be a fun one, but it's SECTS, that kind of sex we're talking about today. And I know that you have a huge following for your podcast, and rightly so, because it is quite an incredible feat how many people you have spoken to who have been involved in cults, sects, and you know, or had near brushes with these sort of environments. So I wanted to jump in, I guess, to say, tell us a little bit about you for those that haven't listened yet to the podcast, because you are quite extraordinary. You are quite a number of things, not just a podcast host.
That's very kind. Thank you, Sandy. Well, yeah, I mean, the podcast, honestly, the whole thing kind of took me by surprise. I came into it with no real idea what I was getting myself into. And I think it was just this kind of interesting timing issue of like the rise in podcast listening, and hitting upon a subject that actually there's a lot of coverage of the more sensational aspects of cults. And the cults that you've heard of are probably the Branch Davidians and Jonestown and all of these kinds of ones. In Australia, it's probably the Family. But I started talking to people in the beginning. I was looking at those kinds of groups, but then I was approached by more and more people who wanted to tell me about a group that I had never heard of, and a group that, you know, didn't live on a compound, and a group that someone who you work with might be involved with. And I hadn't realized when I started how many people were actually involved in these groups. Now it's no surprise to me whatsoever that if I'll start chatting about the podcast at a party or something, no surprise if someone I'm speaking to says, actually, my friend is in a cult, or I grew up in a cult, or I know someone who I think I'm a bit worried about, a friend of mine. So it was a huge shock to me to find out how ubiquitous these groups are, how many of them there are out there, and how under the radar they're flying. But it's sort of taken over my life since I started Let's Talk About Sects, which was originally back in, I think, 2017. And as you said, I've also now done a few other bits and pieces related to that, including putting out a book last year.
Yes, you did. And we will get to the book because I'm super excited to talk about your wonderful book, Do As I Say, which is a great read as well. So we'll get to that. What initially, I guess, drew you to the subject matter? Because at the time when you launched this podcast, there really was no one specifically looking at sex. And as you said, other than the sensationalism of it, what drew you, I guess, even to this kind of field?
Yeah, I mean, it's wild to think about now that there were no other podcasts about cults at the time when I started conceiving of it. By the time I went to launch, there was one other, Joe Thornley's Zealot, which is another Australian podcast about cults. But I mean, even then, that there were no other podcasts at the time about the subject is just, it makes no sense now. There are so many, which is fantastic. But I just had that same fascination that so many people have, you know, this kind of so many questions about like how is it that people become enmeshed in these organizations that cause them to behave in ways that they actually otherwise would never have behaved in, and, you know, sometimes do things that are actually completely against their usual morals and ethics. And, you know, I had questions about kind of brainwashing and whether it really even is a thing. And there's a lot of academic debates about stuff like that I kind of got to dig into in the research. So it was just that same fascination in the beginning that got me interested. But the more I started talking to people who had direct experiences and the more they shared with me those direct experiences, the more apparent it became to me that this is, honestly, I feel like this is a real social justice issue. Like, this is a big problem. There are people coming out of these organizations every day who are dealing with high levels of trauma. And a lot of countries around the world are not doing an awful lot to stop these organizations from kind of controlling people's lives and their choices.
Yeah, and it's quite it's quite insidious, really, when you think about it. And there's a lot of debate in Australia right now about coercive control, and that, you know, how do we put measures in place to protect women and anybody really? But this comes into the domestic violence argument about coercive control and what is it. So when people talk about brainwashing, I guess my mind goes to that. It lends itself to coercive control and how easy it could be for any of us to be coerced depending on what's going on in your life, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that it's a sort of a self-protection mechanism, as it is when we think about domestic abuse relationships, to think, well, I would never end up in that situation, or to ask the question, why didn't you just leave? Which people who've come out of domestically abusive relationships get asked all the time, and people who've come out of cults get asked all the time. And so it helps you psychologically to think that would never happen to me. But I don't think that that's the case anymore at all. And all the people I've spoken to, you know, the huge majority of them they're such well-meaning and wonderful people, many intelligent, you know, thoughtful people who the main thing that they probably have in common is that they were quite idealistic and they had a lot of passion that they wanted to dedicate to doing something meaningful with their lives. And so all that's happened with these people is that they've come across the wrong group at the wrong time. And I always talk about how this is usually a vulnerable point in your life. People think that vulnerable people join cults, but actually what happens is people who are at vulnerable points in their lives fall into cults by accident. And a cult, you know, it doesn't look like a cult from the outside. You don't find that out until probably after you've left, long after you've left. But those sorts of vulnerable times, they happen, you know, when you're moving out of home, and that's why university students can be big recruiting grounds for many cults. You're looking at your life and trying to figure out like what you want to do with it, what you want to dedicate yourself to. You might have come out of a long-term relationship, or you might have lost someone who is really dear to you, and it's caused you to kind of question everything and want to, you know, do something really important. And all of us have those points in our lives, every single one of us. And so actually the idealism that people put into these groups, that's to me often the greatest tragedy of them, is that you've got so many wonderful and well-meaning people who have so much to give, and they're giving it to an organization that's usually about lining the pockets of the guy at the top, to grossly generalize. You know, there are many exceptions, but that tends to be what's actually happening. And I always have to say that you really need to keep in mind it's not always people joining these groups either. There are many, many, many people, and many who I've spoken to, who are born in and they never made that choice.
Yeah, that's quite fascinating for me, because, we do have to have that distinction, I guess, for those that find themselves joining an organisation. Nobody wakes up, and I've heard you say this, and I've heard people like, Mike Rinder say this sort of thing. No one wakes up and to join a cult, right? No one decides to join a cult. And what happens is, I guess, that we attach ourselves to things that seem like they're for the greater good, or things that are going to enhance us spiritually or physically, or whatever it may be. And I think that is really important. And the point that you've made that, many, many, many intelligent people find themselves in these situations. I know that last year you were at Vivid in Sydney and you were on a panel discussion, and one of the people that was on that panel was the wonderful Claire Ashman. Claire's been a guest on this podcast as well, and I think her story was so extraordinary that we had a two-part thing going on here with her. So Claire's a really great example of that, of being born into what she didn't even know was really a sect, or, and then basically marrying someone who leads her into yet another because she really doesn't know any different. I guess you would have spoken to lots of people who have experienced similar things.
Yeah, and Claire, I mean, she's such an incredible woman. Her experience is just, I can't believe the things that she's so strong. She came out of that with all of her children and managed to build a whole new life. She's just so amazing. But yeah, what choices did she ever have? And she was brought up to believe that, women are supposed to be subservient to men. She was, married to a much, much older man, and she never really was able to express her opinion. So she ended up in the Order of St. Charbel, and, who can possibly blame her for it?
No one. And I think it was really, so when I first started this podcast, Claire actually reached out to me and said, I've got a story and I think you might be interested. And I just thought, I was so taken by her bravery and her extraordinary strength to tell that story. For those that haven't listened to Claire, she's quite extraordinary. She does have a TEDx talk. People can listen to her story, and we can put up links to her episode on this podcast and yours. She's quite extraordinary, but I think, as you say, and her story's brilliant in terms of, she's a great example of what happens when somebody's been involved in a cult for a very long time, because a lot of people may not understand this. When she left, yes, with all of her children, but she had no money, no bank account, no passport, no driver's license, nothing. She basically went out into the world with literally the clothes on her back and the clothes that her children were wearing. And this is why, when people say, why don't you just leave?
That's exactly right. It took a sheriff knocking on her door and saying that she was going to be turfed out. And her response was, great, tell me what to do. I've been wanting to get out for ages. And so he gave her some advice on what she needed to do next, which is just, so incredible. But that's right. I mean, she didn't even know how to open a bank account. And it's really worth trying to put yourself in that headspace of being like, how could that possibly feel, trying to go out into a world? And she's quite an extreme example, but I would say, most people, what they're looking at is they've been taught that everything outside of the group is evil. It's a real us and them mentality. So even if there aren't those real physical, commune-based type limitations on leaving, what you're still doing is really entering into the unknown, and most of the time leaving behind your entire network and your entire community, the people who you consider to be your family and friends, whether they literally are or not. And, most of the time taught that what you're probably going to end up in is some kind of hell.
Hello, Sandy here from the Good Girl Confessional Podcast. The Good Girl Confessional Podcast is proudly brought to us by WB40, a platform for women 40, 50, 60 and beyond. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you'd like to see the rest of the video, please head over to WB40.com and subscribe to WB40 Extra. By subscribing to WB40 Extra, you're helping to support the hard-won wisdom of incredible women. So thank you. Please remember to like, share and follow.